I've been reading this sub for over a year now. Oddly, it was my spouse who suggested it. They've always been concerned that I never really spoke in depth about how their affair hurt me and changed me to anyone other than them. They're afraid, I think, that I might harbor some repressed hatred for them. I don't. It's like touching a hot stove. Do it once, and you never purposely do it again. I am that way about my emotions. I am not void of emotions. I just choose to keep some of them safe within myself. Anyway, I recently created a username and began posting because one particular story, for whatever reason, hit me harder than others I read. I spoke with my spouse and showed them something I wrote to this user and asked them if they were okay if I posted their story. They were okay with it and actually encouraged me to include more details than I had intended. Their reasoning was that everyone needed the whole picture to understand why they pursued reconciliation with me so hard, why it worked for us, and to understand why I fought it and how I see our love and our marriage so differently now. After the first draft of this, I read it and got a very uneasy feeling about how my spouse appears in this story and subsequently in our marriage. While they had no problem with the story as written, I decided to add this on the front end. My spouse has become an amazing partner, parent, and person. They hold a professional degree in their career and are well thought of and admired in their field. They suffered greatly too, admittedly due to their own action, and to no lesser degree from me during the reconciliation. They have truly been forged in fire and came out of steel. Their betrayal was devastating, but I think in my case, it was the circumstances surrounding the affair that ultimately allowed me to forgive them, not excuse them, forgive them. I lost a part of the good in me by going through this pain. In contrast, they came out of it a better person. At times, I resent that. But then I see the positive they have brought to my life over the 23 years since this happened, and it's okay. I'm writing this in chronological order. Obviously, I was not aware of some of the events until later. The details come from writings that my spouse did for therapeutic reasons, something they also incorporated into our reconciliation process. We still have the notebooks. We plan on burning them on our 50th wedding anniversary. Background: we married when we were both 20. After about a year, I decided to go back to school part-time to finish my degree. Eventually, we had a child, and I felt the pressure to finish my degree. My child had just turned 2 when I started my last year of college. 2 semesters were all I needed. In September of 1993, my schedule was the following: part-time job from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m., full-time job at the police department administrative job 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., school Tuesday nights from 5:30 p.m. to 10 p.m., and school Saturday from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. My spouse was a nurse's aide at a local hospital working from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. My mother kept our child, school, both of our jobs, and my parents were all close, no more than a 10-minute drive from one to the other. We had as good a setup as possible for what I was trying to accomplish. D-Day. The weekend before D-Day, we had fought constantly. It was spring of '94 and finals week for me. If I finished my papers and passed my finals by the following Sunday, we would be celebrating by completing my bachelor's in science and finally ending this 8-month schedule I was working. But my spouse was upset because I would not take time off from studying to take them and our child someplace. They had been complaining about my work and school for some time now, and it had gotten so bad that we had to stop having sex 2 months prior. On this particular Monday evening, I was fact-checking a research paper I had completed Saturday that was due Tuesday evening, and they were constantly picking an argument. Finally, I told them to shut up and quit acting like a child. They stared at me and boldly announced, "I hate you, and I'm in love with someone else." Just like that, I was stunned. We argued for about an hour until they confessed about what had happened earlier in the day while at lunch at work. It seems for the past 2 months, they had started an emotional affair with the janitor at the hospital. Basically, it started with him complimenting them and always showing up every time they turned around. This graduated to eating lunch together in the cafeteria and then regular sessions of complaining about me to him. They moved the complaining sessions to the car about 2 weeks prior. They later admitted to twice kissing him during this time, but today it had turned into a full makeout session, culminating in them giving him a hand job to finish while he fingered them, and then proclaiming their love for each other. Upon hearing this, I basically broke from the subconscious world. I disassociated from all reality, I think. Later, I will go into further detail regarding my thought process that night. In the meantime, this is what my spouse wrote about that moment. It was strange. When I told him what we had done, I was fully prepared for some type of outburst. He just looked at me with the most horrible pain you can imagine. Then it turned into something I can't describe. It was blank. He turned around and walked to the bedroom and quietly closed the door. I remember getting mad then. The bastard would not even fight for me. I just knew at that moment I had made the right decision and everything was going to work out. I did it. I was breaking free of the person that was ignoring me all these months. I returned to the living room with a suitcase and walked past them and out the front door. I remember them repeatedly asking where I thought I was going. Home to Mommy was what I remembered. I placed the suitcase in the driveway, went back in, grabbed their purse and handed it out, and told them to leave. This shocked them. They refused. I gently threw them over my shoulder, walked out the door, sat them on the hood of the car. Their shock at this allowed me time to get back into the house and lock the door. They tried to get in, but I held the deadbolt, and they eventually left to stay at their parents'. They told them we were separating, but not why. That was a long night. I called into both jobs to let them know I had a family emergency come up and would not be in the next day. At some point, I fell asleep. Tuesday, D-Day +1. I woke up at 7 and immediately began to occupy my time by planning on how to minimize contact with my soon-to-be ex. I called my mother to ask her to keep my child. She was worried because normally my child was there by now. After that, I made a list of things to accomplish that day and I started working the list. First, I dropped my child off and explained to my mother that I would need to sit and talk to her at length later that day. I then went to the office of a lawyer friend of my family. He had gone to school with my dad, and I knew him all my life. I explained I wanted to file for divorce as soon as possible. He listened to my story and suggested I think about things for a while, but I was adamant. He said he could have the divorce papers completed by the end of the day. I told him I would pick them up that day and file them with the clerk's office myself. I dealt with this type of thing at my job with the PD. Next, I went to get new locks for the house and made a stop off at the bank. I emptied and closed both our savings and checking accounts. I placed half the money in an envelope and stopped by my sister-in-law's place of work and gave her my spouse's half of the money. I told her to tell my spouse that they are not to contact me at all, and that was their half of the money from the bank. I also told her I'd canceled our only credit card. Back at my mom's, I told her everything, and she and my little sister came up with a plan for my little sister to stay at my house and watch my child while I worked and went to school for the rest of the week. I made my way home, changed the locks, spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning and playing with my child, and then went to school. My spouse also decided not to go to work that day. They contacted the janitor and told him what had happened. He was sympathetic and invited them over to his house that evening to get away from the stress. More on this house later. Long story short, they went, and they screwed him. Here is what they wrote about that night. He fell asleep after. I remember being so excited at the beginning, but during and after, it began to feel wrong. Since he was asleep, my mind began to wander. I thought about G and how he had made me do this, pushed me to find someone else. I got up and left. On the drive home, I began to remember the first time G and I had sex. We were each other's firsts. I broke down and thought about how disgusted I was with myself. Then I got mad at G all over again. It was really a sick cycle. I would not face the responsibility of how truly horrible the thing I had done was. I convinced myself it was his fault. Wednesday, D-Day +2. That day began as normal. I went to work, came home, showered, and ate breakfast with my child and sister. My spouse called and wanted to make arrangements to see our child. They were cocky and spiteful on the phone. I told them that I would meet them Sunday at 1 p.m. and they could spend some time with our child at the local park. They weren't going for that. They wanted them for the weekend. I said no. They knew our child staying at the house solved the babysitting issue for right now. Both their parents worked, so they did not push it. They slammed the phone down. I went to work at the PD, and the first chance I got, I went to the clerk's office and filed for the divorce. Later in the day, I was notified by a girl I knew there that they were ready to go to the sheriff's office to be served. I called the deputy I knew and told him the story and asked him to serve them at work. He said he would the next day. My soon-to-be ex also returned to work. The janitor came by their station and chatted them up throughout the day. They were not able to eat lunch together that day, nor meet that evening. He claimed he had to go to something with one of his kids. He told my spouse earlier in the affair he was divorced and had 3 kids. They went to their parents after work. Later that night, they called me 3 times, and each time I hung up on them after I found out it was them. Caller ID was not the norm back then in my area. Thursday, D-Day +3. After another long night of grieving, my day started out like the day before. I went to work. After I arrived at my second job, I received a phone call from the deputy that was going to serve the papers. He told me he would get there around noon. I explained that would be fine. Their lunch hour was from 11 a.m. to noon. I sat at my desk and tried to work. I was antsy and got up and went to the restroom at least 3 times until I finally threw up. I calmed myself and kept reminding myself it was the right thing to do. Thankfully, I had not heard from my spouse so far. 11 a.m., my spouse meets the janitor for lunch. They retire to his car in the parking lot and have sex classy. They clean up, go back inside, and grab something in the cafeteria for lunch. Noon, my spouse returns to the nurse's station on their hallway along with the janitor and starts talking to the RN in charge of the hall. 5 minutes later, the deputy walks in. He asks the RN where he can find Kay. My spouse, Kay, speaks up. That's me. The deputy turns to them and in a loud voice says, "Mrs. Kay, you are being sued for divorce due to infidelity." My spouse falls on the floor. Here are their words describing what happened. When I heard that, I felt this massive wave of shame and guilt. It hit me that I had destroyed my marriage, that he was really going to divorce me. Some stupid part of me really believed that he would not do it. I thought this was just another argument I was trying to win. Really sick thinking. I remember the deputy physically picking me up and putting me in the chair. There was screaming. It was me. The RN was trying to calm me down. The janitor tried to grab my hand, and I punched him. He turned his head, and the punch landed on his neck. I scratched him as he pulled away. I said I was yelling at him that he had ruined my life. They got them calmed down. The deputy said the janitor left immediately. They were able to go back to their shift, but the RN did a lot of covering for them. 2:45 p.m. My spouse was close to finishing their shift when they were called to the hospital administrator's office. They were scared. They guessed someone had reported their outburst. When they arrived, the lady closed the door and immediately told them they were fired, not to come back on the property, and that they would receive their last check through the mail. It seems the tryst in the parking lot had been witnessed by someone. They had reported it. At some point, the RN had been called in and had relayed the story about the divorce papers. The janitor was brought in, questioned, fired, and escorted from the property just an hour prior to my spouse being fired. Everyone in the hospital knew about it all. They say they just went to the car and drove to their parents. At this point, their parents still did not know what was going on, just that we were split up, and it appeared serious. 5:30 p.m., I was eating supper with my child at home. My sister was out with friends, and we were just spending time together. The deputy had relayed the events from earlier, and I had gotten quite a bit of satisfaction knowing the reaction. The janitor being there was just blind luck. I was surprised they hadn't been arrested for assaulting him, but hey, you can't have everything. Then there was a knock at the door. Standing in front of me was a lady about 5 feet tall and enormously pregnant, barely able to stand straight. She asked for Kay. I explained they no longer lived there and would not be returning. She asked if I was their spouse. I said soon-to-be ex-spouse. I had served the papers today. She said she was Dee, the janitor's spouse, and she was pregnant with their 4th child. I let her in to sit down. She explained what had happened earlier about her spouse and my spouse getting fired and the circumstances surrounding it. I felt like throwing up. Who the hell was this psycho I had married? She also explained about the house that my spouse met him at. It was at that point I would have murdered him in cold blood right there if I could have found him. Not for my spouse, but for humankind in general. This guy was a piece of crap. Again, more on the house later. She asked me where my spouse was, and I explained that they were with their parents. I gave her directions after she assured me she only wanted to talk to them and let them know the truth. My child was still in their chair at the table, and you could see them from where we sat in the living room. She commented on how wonderful a parent I was to take on the care of my child alone. She got up and left. 6:30 p.m., my father-in-law answered his door, and Dee asked to speak to my spouse. Thinking she was a friend of Kay's, he went and got Kay, who stepped out on the porch to speak to her. Dee told them who she was and that she just wanted to know the truth about what they had gotten themselves into with the janitor. Dee and the janitor were still married and living together. She was 8 months pregnant with their 4th child. Kay was upset and crying at this point and apologizing over and over again. But it got worse. You see, the janitor and another guy at the hospital, along with one of their friends, were playing a game. The goal was to see how many married people they could have sex with in the span of 90 days. Up until my spouse, the third guy was leading with 3. My spouse was the janitor's third. Oh, and the night he had the thing with one of his kids, he had sex with the 4th person. Dee said that the lady had been married 25 years, and Dee was informing her spouse next. It was the neighbor. The house was a place they rented to take the people. Dee found out about this 2 hours after he was fired. He came home high and crying, confessed everything in an attempt to work it out. Dee left with the kids and told my spouse she was leaving him. She then squared up her shoulders and slapped my spouse hard across the face and called them a stupid cow. Kay was stunned. Dee told them they should be ashamed of throwing away their family. She told them how she was at her home an hour ago and watched a loving person feeding their child all alone because their spouse was a stupid, selfish jerk. My spouse lost control, crying, and Dee walked away, got in the car, and left. My in-laws checked on them after hearing the car drive off. They were basically catatonic. They got them inside and were discussing taking them to the emergency room when they began to just talk out of their head. My father-in-law thought they were on speed or something. They started talking about how terrible they were and how they had to fix it. They calmed them down eventually and got the whole story. My father-in-law was really hurt. He was and is a good man. He later said my spouse could see the shame and disappointment on his face. My mother-in-law, well, she blamed me as usual. I'm not fond of her. Immediate aftermath. My father-in-law called me the next day and apologized, the one and only time I ever suspected that my father-in-law had tears in his eyes. He told me what happened and said that Kay had been in their room all day and night. I told him about the appointment Kay had to meet me on Sunday at the park. He said okay and hung up. I worked Friday and went to school that Saturday. By the end of the day, I had found out I had passed and would receive my degree. Bittersweet, but I made it. My parents celebrated that night with extended family coming over and cooking out. I have a great family. No one brought up Kay. The next day, I did not hear from Kay at 1 p.m. I chalked it up to a blessing, something I could use in a custody hearing if needed. At 3:30 p.m., her father called. He said Kay was still not responding coherently to them and just walked around in their bathrobe with this notebook in their hands and would not let it go. They had not bathed in days and only ate sparingly. He was worried and tired. He found himself afraid to sleep in case they hurt themselves. He asked me to come see them. I declined. I couldn't feel anything for them. I told him to get them some help, and I would let them see our child when they could get themselves together. I really felt nothing for them. That first night, I had gone through my own trial by fire and came out stronger. More on that later. I was not going to care about this person ever again. I did not hear from them or their family for 2 weeks. Reconciliation. 2 weeks had passed since I had last spoken with my father-in-law. During that time, I had quit my part-time job and was actively looking for a new job. I had plans to get my MBA, but wanted to take a year or two to get settled in a new job. My child was asking about their parent. I could only comfort them at that point. The longer they went without reaching out to see our child was better for my chances to get a good custody deal. I was at the PD when they called and asked to set up a time to meet up and see our child. I asked them if they had pulled themselves together enough to not scare our child, and they replied yes. I told them I would meet them at 9 a.m. at the park on Saturday and to bring their dad. I did not want to meet them alone. My mother went with me. When I saw them, I knew I had made the right decision to limit their contact to only 2 hours. They were a mess. They had lost a lot of weight. They were not wearing makeup. They smelled like ivory soap, no perfume or deodorant or any of those feminine smells I always associated with them. I found out later their mother had bathed them and dressed them. Kay was not able to function completely yet. Park meetings lasted about 3 weeks, and I extended them to 4 hours and Sunday too. They looked better each week, but I was still concerned about their mental health, and I would not let our child stay with them overnight or see them alone. Eventually, my mother-in-law tired of that and hired an attorney to sue for custody. Now Kay had not signed the divorce papers yet. I was okay with that. In 6 months, I could petition the court for a divorce anyway. But the custody suit pissed me off because she was suing for full custody. I had already told her father I was willing to eventually work up to 50-50 custody, but her mother blew that out of the water. I responded with a request for full custody on the grounds of mental defect. Really, I was ready to rumble. I was pissed and needed an outlet. This was it. On the day of the custody hearing, my lawyer said her attorney had come to him with a request. Kay wanted to speak to me in private. I said no. He said it might be an offer. I relented but wanted it in the hallway outside the courtroom in full view of both attorneys, but where they could not hear what was being said. They agreed. They started out with small talk, asked how me and our child were doing. I said great and getting better every day. They asked about my school. I told them I passed and graduation was next week. They were happy about that. They looked down and asked if they could come and see me walk. I said my graduation was for my family and friends, and they were neither, so no. I really hurt them with that. We had worked hard together for the majority of our time together, and to accomplish that and me saying no showed that they could not share it with me. They said please, and I told them again no. I said it's special to me. It didn't matter enough to you when you let someone use you like trash. I was really becoming a huge jerk, and I wanted to hurt them. They teared up, turned around, and walked back to their attorney. The hearing started. I got up and testified. Nothing unusual. Mother-in-law got up and put all the blame on me, said I was seeing someone, and it drove my spouse crazy. No proof of that, but she was never one to care about truth. She also claimed I had assaulted my spouse by grabbing them and throwing them on the hood of the car the night they left. Then it was my spouse's turn. Kay began answering questions from her lawyer, but stopped after about the third one. They asked the judge if they could say something. He told them they might want to confer with their attorney first, but they declined. He said, "Go ahead." Here's my spouse's words from their notebook. I remember how sad I was after the hearing started. I listened to G give his side of the story and how he had taken care of our child, J, all these weeks. I needed to make this right. I sat there listening to my mama, and I knew she was lying to protect me. But it was just another lie on top of a lie. I had enough. I had to fix this. Kay then stated that they wanted to apologize to my parents who were in the room. They also apologized to their own parents. They looked at me and said they knew that right now I hated them more than anyone in the world. They said everything that happened was their fault, and at this point, they just wanted to salvage anything they could of what we had together, if it was only to get me to be able to look at them without disgust. They then told the judge they wanted to withdraw their claim and would adhere to any custody arrangement I saw fit to give them. I conferred with my attorney, and we offered supervised 1-hour visits for 6 weeks, with our child staying with them every other weekend after that if there were no problems. We adjourned. Looking back, I think that is when I saw a small ray of possibility we could be nicer to each other, not reconcile, but at least be cordial. The schedule worked fine. After the third week, we were spending that visitation time with just them, me, and our child. It usually extended to 3 or 4 hours. I was not friendly, but I really enjoyed watching our child play with their other parent. It helped them both. The only negative incident happened during the 5th visit. They came up behind me and hugged my right arm. I was watching our child play. I freaked out. I yelled at them to never touch me ever again. They hugged our child and left quickly. The next week, we just acted as though nothing happened, and they kept their distance. Another month passed, and we were talking more about day-to-day issues. I had a new job that was paying more, and they had begun nursing school. They began to tell me that the janitor was calling them and would not leave them alone. They claimed they wanted to be honest with me in case I heard. They had told him to leave them alone, but he still showed up at their parents' house one night. Father-in-law threatened to kill him if he didn't leave them alone. I told them I did not care who they slept with anymore. They said they were not sleeping with anyone and never would until they knew that we could never put our family back together. I told them it was never going to happen. 6 months after our separation, I brought up the fact that they needed to sign the divorce papers. They said no. I reminded them I did not need them to sign them, but it would be easier if they would. They asked if they could come by the house that night so we could talk, and if I still wanted a divorce, they would sign them that night. I agreed. They showed up with these notebooks, the little black composition notebooks that look like a bound book. They told me they started writing down the things the day after they got the divorce papers. They do not know why, but it seemed to help. They said they wrote everything they could remember about what had happened in as much detail as they could. They wanted me to read it, but warned me it would hurt bad. They wrote about what they said and did with the janitor. I really did not want to read it. They said they knew they were taking a risk, but they had to do something to make me understand why they were trying to save our marriage. So I read it. They were right. It was hard. The sex part was not really detailed. It was described in general terms. But what they said about me and our marriage to him, damn, that got deep. The book I read that night also chronicled their mental breakdown. The writing was jumbled and unorganized, but every day it got better and better. They eventually began to dissect what they had done and said it was their therapy. One funny passage was when they described an insane conclusion that they came to and were convinced it would set all things right. You see, they remembered they never had an orgasm with the guy, never. If they did not come, then that meant they did not enjoy it. Therefore, they did nothing wrong, and I would have to take them back. They believed that until they explained it to their dad, much to his discomfort, and he told them it did not work that way. Reading the book did not change my mind, but it scared me. I was still concerned about their mental state. Until I read what and how they wrote during those 2 weeks, I did not realize how fragile their mind had gotten. I agreed to give it some more time. This gave them the courage to start pushing me to write to them. Sit down, write a letter or something about what had happened. They would then get a better sense of how to help me. I thought about this, and I knew I was still messed up pretty bad, and that maybe it would help me move on and still have some type of healthy relationship down the road. Their writing therapy, as I called it, evolved into this. We would meet 2 nights a week. Our first assignment would be to write down where we saw the state of our marriage prior to D-Day. At the meeting, we would exchange letters and make notes. We would then put our questions in writing and ask them to the other person. We would talk until each question was fully answered and go to the next one. If we did not finish, then we would extend those questions to the next meeting. The rules were simple: answer honestly, no yelling, and no declining to answer any question. We started with an analysis of our pre-D-Day marriage and went through each subsequent day until the Sunday I spoke with their father after they received the divorce papers. After that, we would reevaluate and go from there. I will say I was a complete jerk about this. I answered questions honestly, except for one. More on that later. But I used it to humiliate them. I made them repeat over and over the bad things they said to him about me. I made them give excruciating details about the sexual contact. They balked sometimes, but they always went through with it. While it was really vanilla compared to what we did when we were together, it hurt. Honestly, I thought I could handle it because I was really not interested in getting back together, but it was really bad to hear it. It's hard to believe how cruel I had become, but again, in my mind, it was justified at the time. After about a month of this, I had to admit it helped me some. They proposed to move back in and try the next step. I said no. They really begged and offered a good argument for it, but I said no. I told them even if I wanted to reconcile, there was no way I could be intimate with them again. They were okay with that, and I said I could go outside the marriage while they stayed faithful. That's not me, so no. After another month, I relented but laid down some rules. The rules were non-negotiable and set in stone. First, they had to sleep in the spare room. Second, absolutely no physical contact at all. Third, they kept their money in their checking account, but I handled their banking and gave them checks to pay their bills, including rent for the room and expenses, and money to spend. This was due to the fact that they had given the janitor $300 out of our savings account a week before D-Day. Plus, I thought they would say no and not move in. Fourth, their mother was not to come into my home until we decided to reconcile. I was still pissed at her, still am a little. Fifth, all prior custody agreements were to automatically kick in if we did not reconcile. Sixth, if I found someone else, they had 1 week to move out. They agreed and moved in. It was harder than I thought. I no longer had that cooling down period between the times I saw them. They were there all the time. I started small fights all the time, said hateful things to them. I wanted them out almost immediately after they moved back in. I had to do something, so we implemented Thursday night fight night. This came out of the meetings we had where we were writing. Every Thursday night after our child was asleep, We would sit in the living room and discuss things that we were having issues with or any arguments that were still ongoing. Those had to be settled on Thursday night before bed and could not go any further. We actually still have a version of this today. It evolved into simply asking over dinner if we had anything to talk about that night. Our children never knew where it came from or really what it was. I was still being difficult. I threw their affair at them every chance I could. They took it in stride and never engaged when it got to that point. I would say I was emotionally abusive to them, but they were strong. They knew that we were meant to be, and since they destroyed our lives, they had to build it back on their own until I saw what they saw and joined them. And they were committed to giving me the time I needed. 6 months after they moved back in, I had my own breakthrough. After a particularly hard day of one trigger after another, I had locked myself in the bedroom. I just could not do it any longer. My spouse came to the door and knocked and quietly said, "You need to talk. I will be out here when you think you can." I heard them slide down the door, sit on the floor, and lean their back against the door. For an hour, they sat there. It was almost midnight when I opened the door. They asked me if they could come in, and I told them no and said, "Let's go to your room." We went to their room, and they sat on the bed, and I sat in a chair, and I finally told them what had happened after I kicked them out the night I found out about the affair. Flashback to the evening of D-Day. After they drove off, I spent a lot of time in my child's room just watching them sleep. I went into my desk, retrieved the checkbook and my bill ledger, and took them along with a copy of the life insurance policy and put them in plain sight on the kitchen table. I went and took a shower. I then went into the bedroom and got my shotgun down from the shelf in the closet and laid it on the bed. I dressed in a pair of jeans and a button-down shirt, put my shirt tail in and all, combed my hair. I have no idea how long I sat there. I then got up, unloaded the gun, and put it back, stripped off my clothes, and went to bed. Unfortunately, I think this type of thing enters into many betrayed spouses' minds. I explained to them that that was the only thing I had held back during our recovery. For the first time, I allowed them to hug me and kiss me on the forehead, something other than a goodbye or see you later. It was the first emotional touch I had allowed them to have with me. I told them I forgave them that night, but I did not mean it. It was a number of months later before I actually meant it. But saying the words then cracked the door open for me. After that, physical touch increased, slowly, holding hands, a kiss goodbye, a hug, etc. These began to be more normal occurrences in our relationship. Sex was not happening, but we were headed that way, and eventually, almost a year after they moved in, we finally were intimate. I think this was our historical bonding time. They were still journaling, and according to them, we had sex 32 times in 28 days. Later, we were talking, and they told me that until that night we had sex, they woke up every morning thinking today would be our last day together. They kept telling themselves, just one more day. They knew me well enough to know that sex meant I was rebounding. Today we have a good marriage, both successful in our careers. We have 3 grown children. They do not know about any of this as far as we know. No plans to tell them, but no plans to lie if they ask. We both changed a lot. My spouse is a lot stronger and wiser. They look back on this as an unnecessary evil that they caused, but they successfully overcame. I sometimes think they still punish themselves for it. For my part, it does not come up in discussions or arguments at all, hasn't in over 20 years. They're very perceptive, and more often than not, they recognize when I experience a trigger. And yes, they do still happen, maybe once or twice a year. They are swift and short, but they sting. Usually, they will grab my hand and hold it. Sometimes they will hug me and say, "I love you," or simply, "Thank you." I lost some of the good in myself. I hold a lot of my feelings back and deal with them myself. While I try to support their emotional needs, they know I will not be their emotional tampon anymore. It's their job to let me know what the issue is and put forth a plan to fix it, which I will help to implement. I love them. I had to learn to love them again. It's different, more realistic, but intense nonetheless. As I said earlier, I feel I had to lose a part of the good in me so they could become a better person, and at this point in my life, I am good with that. I hope this helps someone. Every situation is different, but this worked for us, and I'm thankful for that. I'm not preaching reconciliation. I am preaching self-care. Handle yourself. Fix what you have control of, not what you can't. Do what benefits you and your situation. Be selfish to a point, then see about becoming a we again in a marriage or relationship later. Google the Serenity Prayer. No truer words have ever been written in my opinion. And remember, the sub is Surviving Infidelity. You're reading about the worst days of our lives in marriage. There are many greater, happier memories we have created that far outweigh this tragedy. I wish you all the best in this journey. You do win on the other side of the pain if you put forth the effort for yourself. Thanks so much for being open and honest with us. It's not often we hear of stories like this where people are open to bearing it all, embracing the very worst of themselves, and willing to crawl through the flames to get out on the other side, a completely different person. We went through the inferno. It felt nice to read their perspective through it all, as we rarely hear from the cheater in these cases. I think it's quite common for cheaters to blame their partners for their own actions because it's easier to blame someone else than really take a look inside. And as for how I was treating my spouse, that's valid. When we're hurt and hurting, we want to hurt others. We harbor that hurt. It's easier to hold on to the hate and the hurt than it is to forgive. Update. It's hard to believe it's been so long ago that I posted this. I stepped away from this account because I read so much trolling privately by people that are so hardcore against reconciliation. And I get it. Many who reached out for help after I posted were quickly informed I don't recommend reconciliation. It's hard. It's difficult. It's painful. But if you can do it under the right conditions, it has its own rewards. I just wanted to let everyone know we are still married. We now have grandkids, and if you know it's a completely different type of love. My spouse is semi-retired and works PRN now, meaning when needed, when they want. I continue to work full-time, but we find a lot of time to travel. I don't remember the last time I had a trigger, maybe about 3 years ago, and only because our oldest found out about my spouse's affair through a vindictive relative that lives a very lonely life. My spouse handled it with such grace and humility that I think it affected me in a way that I have finally just moved on completely. They apologized for the pain they caused me, and we both explained that it was in the past, that any issue our child had with it, we would help them, but caution them that ultimately it was between us and fell under things that were our business. It has not appeared to have had any effect on their relationship, though they were extremely embarrassed. That's about it. We wish all of you going through this pain the best. Now let's check in with the comments. The first one says, and none of this would have happened if you didn't act like a person at the beginning and didn't throw them out like a piece of trash. A cheater needs to be hit by reality like a truck. Otherwise, they stay forever in their delusional wonderland where nothing is their fault. Many people here should learn this lesson. I replied, honestly, I did it to more gain control of myself. In the weeks looking back after their admitting to the affair, it was easier to make decisions regarding my child, my finances, my life in general, all without giving one hoot in hell how it affected them. That was huge. Also, by the time they were ready to try to fix things, it was truly on them to make it right. They spent a long time with one foot out the door before I truly accepted them back. Another commenter says, this is really beautiful. Thank you for sharing it. We all differ in the details and in how we choose to go forward, but I think we have many of the same thoughts and feelings, and it's really good just to know that at least you're not the only one. I wouldn't wish this on anyone ever, but at least we can use the pain to strengthen each other. I'm sorry you were hurt, but I'm glad you found your way here. That janitor guy, though, what a piece of crap. One more comment. I'm in the midst of the fresh torment of infidelity. We weren't married, but this was going to be it for me. They seem so lost right now and making horrible decisions after horrible decisions. I can't help them. I have to step back. What you wrote gave me such a great piece about doing what I have to do. That and many tears. Thank you for sharing your story of redemption. I'm so happy for your happy ending. Peace be to you and the love of your life. 6 years update. Sad news for me and my family. 3 weeks ago, my former wayward spouse passed away. They battled colon cancer for 6 months and passed away with all of us by their bedside in the home we built 4 years ago to spend our retirement in. They were only 18 months into their retirement when diagnosed. I do not have the ability to explain the loss. It's beyond anything I've experienced. Even that pain that we all experienced in this community has betrayed loved ones. They spent our remaining years after our reconciliation making up for the pain they caused and succeeding in a spectacular fashion. I miss them. Our kids miss them. But I'm here for a reason. They wrote a letter to me in their final days. They instructed our pastor to give it to me after the funeral when he felt the time was right. I read this letter 3 days ago, and I want to share the passage from that letter with all of you who have read our story and have gotten any type of good from that post. It illustrates our need as the betrayed to forgive, and those that betray and are truly remorseful that they too suffer long-term for their betrayal. Quote, I feel a lot of physical pain right now, as you know. But my faith makes me see what's to come, and the pain fades some. Pain has a way of making one turn inward, and I have been looking inward a lot in these past weeks. Sometimes I think I deserve the pain because of what I did to you, did to us so many years ago. But then you pick me up and place me in my chair and help me eat. You bathe me, hold my hand, play your guitar while I lose myself in my memories. I realize this pain is a gift. It's allowing me to experience the essence of love at its purest form, your true forgiveness for what I did. Because only true love and forgiveness are reflected in your actions as you take care of me. I love you so much. There was a lot more, but I wanted to share this with the community and thank you for being in our lives, however tangential. And I love you too. Well, folks, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed the content as much as I enjoyed making it. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Drop a comment below with your thoughts and tell me your stories. I'd love to hear them. Cheers, and see you in the next one.